Professor Scalar, a man with many different nicknames, among them being one that stands high above the rest, the Guide Master. Not only has this man made countless level guides, but he's also done multiple guides on specific mechanics in GTFO, such as terminals, melee weapons, tools, and enemy statistics. And with it being more than 5 months since his last non-level specific guide, it's time for him to once again show the world why he's earned the title Guide Master. Oh my god, that's so cringe. Okay, cut. I can't keep going with that stupid bit. Oh god, that made me sound so egotistical. Holy crap. Hello everyone, Professor Scalar here, and welcome to my extensive guide on alarm doors. For newer and even experienced players, alarm doors can be the bane of one's existence as they are present in nearly every single level you'll play, and they can easily overwhelm those who aren't fully prepared. So in today's guide, my goal is simple. I want to help you gain a thorough understanding of alarms so that you'll be able to walk up to any security door in the game and then be able to set up a defense that not only gives you the highest chance of survival, but also consumes the least amount of resources needed. And in order to do that, we're going to be dividing this video up into 2 main chapters. Chapter 1 will be us going over the different types of alarms in the game and how they operate, so that you'll be able to know exactly what to expect when you read that red text on a security door. Because there are many different types of alarms, and some of them work quite similar to others, but some of them can be quite unique. So in order for us to understand how to set up a proper defense, we need to understand what the alarm is and what to expect. And speaking of defenses, that's what Chapter 2 is going to be all about. There we will be talking about how to analyze your surroundings so that you can take advantage of the terrain, the route that enemies are more than likely going to take, and utilize the tools that you brought in with you to set up a solid defense. A defense that will not only just keep you alive, but also consume the fewest amount of resources necessary. That way when we get further into the level and we see more and more alarm doors or other challenges we have to face, we will have the resources that we need. Because I've seen a lot of newer players blow pretty much all the resources right off the get-go with the first alarm or two, and then they just don't have nearly enough resources to actually deal with the last few alarms or the final twist mechanic if a level has it. And then once we go over all of this, we'll wrap this video up like a beautifully wrapped present with the outro. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Starting off, before we start talking about these special types of alarms, let's talk about just a normal basic alarm and what you can expect from it. So whenever you walk up to a security door and you look at the handle, you'll be able to see some text appear. And in that text, if you see red color text that says something specifically like warning class 3 alarm detected or warning class 6 alarm detected, you know that you're about to deal with a normal alarm. If you see some other words or letters in that red text portion, it is going to be something different, but we'll get to that in a few moments. So when it comes to regular alarm doors, the only thing you really need to take note of is just simply what the number is. Because that number can range anywhere from 1 all the way up to 10. And that number signifies the total amount of sets of scans you have to do in order to shut off the alarm and unlock the door. And that number is always going to be a Roman numeral. So if you don't know what those look like, here's a list of all the Roman numerals from 1 to 10. And I highly recommend that you memorize these because the last thing you want to do in a run is just go up to a security door, misread it, and now you think you're about to deal with a class 2 or a class 3 alarm, when in reality you're about to deal with a class 5 or 6 or maybe even a class 7. And then the other thing to take note of would just be the type of scans you are going to actually be doing. Because almost every single regular alarm door will follow the same pattern. You activate the security door and you're going to have to deal with a big orange full team scan right next to the door, which, as the name insinuates, everybody has to be in it in order for it to gain progress. And then every single set of scans afterwards is either going to be 4 small red scans, 2 big red scans, or 1 big red scan. And when it comes to these, you just want to divide and conquer. Because even though scans do gain progress faster the more people you have in them, it's better to make sure that every single scan is actually being worked on instead of just focusing purely on one scan first and then going for a different one. So if you have 4 small red scans, everybody should be taking their own scan. 2 big red scans, 2 people in each. 1 big red scan, all 4 people should be inside of it. And also, when it comes to scans and them gaining progress, There have been a lot of rumors ever since the beginning of this game of things you can do to make them gain progress faster, and almost every single one of them is completely false. If you've ever been told that standing in a scan and crouch spamming like crazy will cause it to gain progress faster, you have been bamboozled. That is not true, it just simply makes it look like you're teabagging the open air for no reason whatsoever. The only rumor that is actually slightly true is the hacking tool one, because there is a booster in the game that states that if you have a hacking tool in your hand, bioscan speeds will be increased. But the thing is, you have to have that booster equipped in order for that actually to happen. And then the only real thing I need to mention before moving on to the next alarm type is that sometimes regular alarms can pull a fast one on you. Sometimes instead of them having small red scans or big red scans, it will be nothing but large full team scans. And if you do happen to come across an alarm like this, you just need to make sure that your team is fully aware that there is another full team scan on the field and that everybody needs to come over and work on it. That way you could complete it and move on to the next set. Next on the list, we have a simple alarm type, and that would be the Diminished Alarm, which honestly, Diminished Alarms aren't even really their own standalone alarm since there aren't any unique scans that can only be tied to them. Rather, Diminished Alarms are more so like a modifier that can be applied to almost any other alarm in the game. So when you walk up to a security door and you're reading that red text, if you see the word diminished anywhere, that lets you know that the diminished modifier is being applied to that door, which will make it that during the alarm, there will be fewer enemies that spawn in per each individual wave. However, the waves of enemies are going to be spawning in faster than they typically do. So, for example, these are random numbers I'm pulling off the top of my head, so by no means are these necessarily accurate. Let's say that a normal alarm door would spawn in 20 enemies per wave, and it takes about 40 seconds for each individual wave to spawn in. A diminished alarm would change that and make it so that only 10 enemies spawn in per each wave. However, it might only take about 10 or 15 seconds for each wave to spawn in. Most of the time you can expect to see these in either A or B tier levels, as I've noticed 10 Chambers likes to use these in some of the earlier levels. That way they can still have newer players face off against maybe a class 4 or a class 5 alarm, but because it's diminished, it's a little bit easier to actually handle. Next up, we have cluster alarms, and you can easily tell you're about to deal with one of those because when you read the red text on a door, you will see the word cluster. That is your indicator. And when it comes to cluster alarms, unlike diminished, they do change up how the scans work. Just like a normal alarm door, the first scan you do will be a big orange full team scan right next to the door. But then every single set of scans afterwards is going to consist of 8 small orange scans. And despite them being the color orange, you can complete each scan with just a single person in them. And they actually complete incredibly quickly, much faster than the small red scans do from typical alarms. The thing is though, there are 8 of these scans you have to do per wave, which means there's twice as much, and these scans are programmed to spread as far out as possible as they can from each other. So if you're in a small room where there's not a lot of wiggle room for the scans, they'll appear pretty close to each other, maybe even inside of each other a little bit, which will make it very easy to complete them and actually make the alarm go by pretty quickly. But the thing is, if you're in a really big room and there are multiple layers to it, those scans are going to go every which way but loose, which will make it a whole lot more difficult for your team, as even though it might only be a class 3 cluster alarm, it might feel more like a class 5 or a class 6 alarm because of how long it's going to take for you to actually get to every single one of the scans and complete them. So be very cautious of cluster alarms when you're in big open rooms. If you love the color purple, then you're going to love this next alarm. That, or you're absolutely going to hate it. And that would be the sustain alarm. That, or sometimes it's known as the S alarm, because the thing is, when you look at a security door, you'll never see the word sustain in that red text. Rather, you'll just see a lone capital S. So something like a class 1S alarm or a class 5S alarm. And sustain alarms are pretty interesting. There's a few different types of them, and they work quite a bit differently than any other type of alarm in the game. So when dealing with a sustain alarm, every single one of the scans is going to be a purple scan, and every single one of these sustain scans is going to be a full team scan, so everybody has to be in it for it to gain progress. But the unique thing about them is that if anybody is to step out of the scan before it completes, or if somebody is to go down because they got killed by an enemy, the scan will not only stop gaining progress, but it will start to lose progress at the same rate at which it was gaining it. So if you were in a sustain scan for about 10 seconds and then somebody dies and it takes you 10 seconds to get them back up, then almost all the progress you gained in that scan will have been depleted and you'll have to start all over again. So you're going to want to make sure you heal up as much as you can, or at least heal everybody up to about 40 or maybe 60%, and then maybe hold on to some med packs if you can. That, or if you're running low on health and you do not have med packs that you can use, if you're the lowest person on your team, maybe stand behind your other teammates. That way there's a lower chance of you actually getting hit by the enemies and you have a higher chance of survival. And the other thing too is, like I said, there are a few different variations to sustain scans. You have your typical class 4, class 5 sustain alarms, but you also have a class 1 sustain alarm, which works quite a bit differently. A lot of people, when they see a class 1 S alarm, celebrate because they think it's just going to be one simple scan and the alarm will be finished in no time. But the thing is, class 1 S alarms take even longer than class 4 or even sometimes class 5 sustain alarms, because that one big sustain scan is going to require you to be in it for anywhere from about 1.5 to 2.5 minutes. So if you see a class 1 S alarm, be prepared because you're going to have to hold your ground for quite a while. And then there's another variation known as the sustain cluster alarms. These have very rarely ever appeared throughout the history of GTFO, but when they have, they work similar to that of a regular sustain alarm, where maybe the first scan is just going to be a single purple scan you have to do, but then some of the sets of scans are actually going to have 3 sustain scans you have to do. So for example, a class 3 sustain alarm that appeared back in R5D1 required you to do 1 sustain scan, and then 3 sustain scans, and then 3 more. So it was more like a class 7 sustain alarm, even though it was considered a class 3. And then finally, we have probably one of the more difficult ones, and that would be a full zone alarm. These will never be activated via a door. You're never going to walk up to a security door and see it say something like full zone alarm detected. The only time these things actually ever activate is when you go up to a terminal in a room and you have to put a special command into it. And you can usually identify that this is going to be the case because you'll go into that zone via one entrance, and then there'll be 2 or maybe 3 other security doors that are tied to that zone you're in, but every single one of them is under lockdown, and your objective is telling you to find the terminal in the zone and put a specific command into it. So if you find yourself in a situation like that, there's a very, very high chance you're about to deal with a full zone alarm, which is basically just a gigantic sustain scan that allows you to go anywhere inside the room you want, but you could be holding out anywhere from 1 minute to maybe even 3.5 minutes. Some people like to refer to these as the Thunderdome because you're going to be stuck in there for quite a while and you're going to have to kill a lot of enemies in order to complete the scan. So whenever you're about to deal with a full zone alarm, you need to make sure you prepare accordingly and find a good place to hold out. That way you do not just simply get surrounded by enemies. Sometimes it can be boring doing the same type of scan over and over and over again during an alarm, so how about we shake things up a little bit with our next type of alarm? And that would be the mixed alarm, also known as the M alarm. Because just like sustain scans, you'll never see a security door that has the word mixed tied to it. It'll instead just be something along the lines of warning class 4 M alarm detected, or warning class 6 M alarm detected. And when dealing with mixed alarms, any type of scan is basically fair game. You could see things like full team scans, 4 small red scans, 1 or 2 big red scans, cluster scans, sustained cluster scans. Any of that is fair game for a mixed alarm, and this changes depending on the level itself. So when you're about to deal with a mixed alarm, just realize that there are going to be some moments where all of you will be able to stay close to each other because of a full team scan or a sustained scan, and there are going to also be moments during that same alarm where you all have to spread out like crazy because of 8 small cluster scans or maybe 4 small red scans that appeared. Next up on the list, we have by far the most difficult type of alarm that this game could possibly throw at you, and that would be the surge alarm. Surge alarms could come in one of 2 different forms. Either they could be their own standalone alarm where every single one of the scans is going to be a full team scan that takes longer than your average full team scan does, or they can act like a diminished alarm and be a modifier that affects a different type of alarm like a cluster alarm, a sustain alarm, a mixed alarm, or whatever it is that you could possibly think of. And in both of these situations, surge alarms are incredibly annoying to deal with, because most alarms in the game work the same way. They just simply spawn in a wave of enemies, of maybe like 10 to 20 enemies, and then there's a good time period between the next wave spawning in. Maybe it's about 15 enemies, and then you have about 30 seconds before the next 15 spawn in, and this will not change no matter how quickly you kill off that first wave. But surge alarms are completely different. Rather, surge alarms 99% of the time will only spawn in regular strikers, and it will spawn in the spawn limit right off the get-go, which I believe right now is about 25 regular strikers. So as soon as you initiate a surge alarm, it spawns in 25 regular strikers, and the moment you kill off a few of them, it will immediately replace them to make it so that you basically have a non-stop horde coming after you. So if there's a lot of distance between you and the spawn location for the enemies, it's honestly not the worst thing in the world if you have some C-foam or mines and doors and sentries, because you can thin out that first horde a little bit, and then by the time they get to you, you just kill off the remaining few, and the next part of the second horde hasn't hit you quite yet, because there's still some distance they have to travel to get to your location. But if their spawn location is much closer to you, then surge alarms can be absolutely terrifying, because no matter how quickly you kill off the enemies, you're still going to have more enemies that are coming right into your room and beelining straight for you. So you need to make sure that you analyze your situation very closely when dealing with a surge alarm and try to find out exactly what route enemies are going to take and what you could do when it comes to mines and C-foam and doors and sentries. That way you don't have basically a constant 25 enemies in your face that you and your entire team have to shoot until you finish every single one of the scans. And also, you gotta keep in mind that in your typical surge alarm, every single scan is a full team scan, so if somebody goes down, you need to get them up quickly, but you also need to be careful that not everybody stops shooting at the horde and tries to go for the revive at the same time. Otherwise, I can guarantee that everybody on your team is gonna die very, very quickly. Next up, we have an alarm type that many people, including myself, were asking for ever since almost basically the beginning of this game, and that would be the traveling alarm, also known as the Class T alarm. Traveling alarms will only ever have one scan tied to them, and most of the time it is going to be a full team scan, so everybody has to be present in it. And just like the name insinuates, as everybody is standing in that scan and is gaining progress, it is going to be moving down a predetermined path throughout the room. So you just all have to make sure you stand in it, keep up with it while you're dealing with the enemies as they come after you, and just get it all the way to the end of the route and wait for it to hit 100%. As for setting up for this, you're going to want to make sure that you set up your sentries not near you and where you start off at, but rather near the entrance that enemies have to take to get into your room. That way, no matter where you are in the progress of that scan, enemies will be going through the line of fire of the sentry or sentries, and they'll actually be able to put in some pretty good work. And as for you and your team, you just need to be a little bit careful. Make sure that you're not accidentally shooting people or strafing too much, because one poorly placed bullet into the back of somebody's head could bring your run to an end very quickly during a traveling alarm. So be very careful. Usually it's a good idea to have the people who are sort of closer to the enemies crouch down a little bit. That way the people in the back could shoot above them. That or just try to spread out a little bit on the scan, or maybe just simply dedicate yourself as somebody who will never shoot unless if I see a perfect opportunity where I'm guaranteed to not accidentally dome my teammate. Second to last on the list, we have a notorious alarm, and that would be the error alarm. When it comes to error alarms, I don't even know where to really start with them because they break so many rules and they work completely differently compared to any other type of alarm out there in the game. Error alarms will not spawn in waves of enemies over and over and over again, or at least not like a normal alarm door does. Rather, no matter what the error alarm is, it will follow a specific rule, and it's really the only rule that error alarms actually like to follow. And that would be that each error alarm will spawn in a specific enemy, a set amount of that specific enemy, every set amount of seconds until either the end of the level or until the error alarm has been deactivated. So for example, in one level, an error alarm will spawn in 3 regular strikers roughly every 25 seconds. But in another level, an error alarm might spawn in 6 chargers roughly every 50 seconds. Or maybe in a different level, an error alarm will spawn in 7 giant strikers roughly every 3.5 minutes. It changes from level to level, and you'll never know exactly what the error alarm is going to do until you actually activate it. In which case, I recommend that you activate it, wait for a wave to spawn in, deal with the wave and see how many enemies there were and what type of enemies they were, and then wait for the next wave to spawn in and keep a timer going. That way, once you hear the next wave spawn in, you can stop the timer and you can see approximately how long it took, and this will give you a better idea of how to play around this error alarm, because in some levels, it is very focused on making sure that you take into consideration how often that error alarm is going to be spawning in enemies. That way you don't rush into a room with a lot of enemies and just have everything wake up because that wave spawned in there with you. So very situational. I wish I could give better advice, but unfortunately I can't. The only other thing to really mention about error alarms is, like I briefly said earlier, in some levels you are able to deactivate error alarms, but in other levels you are unable to. When you can deactivate them, sometimes it won't tell you how to, and in other times it will tell you to go and find a specific terminal. So as you can see with the background footage, this security door has an error alarm tied to it, but it's also telling us a specific terminal in the level that we can use to deactivate it. The thing is though, the game does not tell us where that terminal is, so we need to hop on a terminal elsewhere in the level and query it. That way we know exactly which zone we have to head into to deactivate that error alarm. And last but not least, we have something that technically isn't an alarm door, but it's similar enough to one that I figured that I should mention in this list anyway, and that would be the blood door. Blood doors are basically the opposite of an alarm, where instead of enemies spawning in from behind us and coming to us as we're working out scans, we have to defend against them. Enemies will only spawn in on the other side of the blood door, and all we have to do is just either open up the door or do a full team scan that's tied to the door and then open it up afterwards. which makes it so that setting up for blood doors is so much more simpler than that of an alarm door, because all we have to do is go to that blood door and place 1 or 2 parallel mines with the door or 1 or 2 perpendicular mines. That way, as we activate the door and enemies start spawning in, the moment the door opens up, all those enemies are pressed up against it, will just immediately blow up to the mines, and we just have to deal with a few enemies that did manage to survive the explosion, or the enemies that were naturally sleeping in the room that didn't die to the mines but now are awake because of them. In which case, we could just have a biotracker person warn us in advance if there are already enemies naturally sleeping on the other side of that blood door, or if it looks completely clear. And of course, we could also place our sentries facing towards that door. That way, anything that does survive not always gets shot at by us, but also our sentries. And the only other thing I really need to mention about blood doors is the fact that not every single blood door in this game is just simply a blood door. Sometimes blood doors can have an alarm tied to them, so I recommend that before you walk up to it, mine it and pull the trigger, read what the text says on the door, because if you see it say warning motion detectors triggered, you know that it's just simply a blood door. But if you see it say warning class 3 alarm detected, that means you have to deal with the alarm first to properly unlock the door, and then you can open up the door afterwards and deal with the blood door portion of it. But now that we've talked about every single one of the different types of alarms in this game, it's time to move on over to Chapter 2, where we're going to be talking about quite a few different things that will help you more efficiently set up for alarms and get your defenses in order. Alrighty, so now that you have a good understanding of the different types of alarms in this game, let's talk about how we can properly set up our defenses. Because trust me when I say, there's sometimes a bit more to it than just simply shutting and mining and C-foaming every single one of the doors and then placing our sentries facing towards them. There's a list of a few different things you're going to want to check for when you come across an alarm door, and the first thing on that list would be, are there any other security doors nearby that also have an alarm tied to them? Because in some levels you will have 2 alarm doors in the same room, or at least maybe 1 or 2 rooms away from each other, and sometimes in those situations you will not have to go to both of those alarms, and in other levels you're going to have to go into one of the alarm door areas to go further, collect a key card or something, and then backtrack and go through that other security door which has an alarm tied to it. So in those situations where you see you have multiple alarm doors in close proximity and you will have to go to both of them, you need to see which doors are tied between the 2 alarms. A good example of this would be R7B3. As you can see with this map, there's an alarm door right down here that we have to go through to get a key card, that way we can progress further into the level. And these 4 doors up here can be utilized during this alarm. But the thing is, once we get that key card, we're going to be coming back to this security door, plugging it in, and then there's an alarm tied to it. And during that alarm, those same 4 doors could still be utilized for the alarm. So if we're doing the first alarm and we shut every single one of those 4 doors and they all get broken down, yes, it'll make things easier for us for that first alarm since enemies would take a lot longer to get to us. But when we come back after to deal with the second alarm, we don't have any of those doors, so if enemies spawn from the south, they are going to get to us incredibly quickly. So what we're going to want to do is only use some of the doors on the first alarm, that way we can still use some of them on the second. So in this situation, we're going to leave these 3 doors open and only shut, mine, and C-foam this door, and then maybe re-C-foam it a little bit during the alarm. That way enemies don't get into our room all that quickly. And then when we come back and deal with that second alarm, sure, this door right here is broken down because of the first alarm, but these 3 doors are still preserved, which means we can utilize them for that alarm to make things a bit easier for us. And this is very situational because it'll change from level to level, but if you see yourself in one of these situations, you're going to want to think a little bit and figure out, okay, which door should we use and which door should we preserve? That way we have doors we can utilize for both of the alarms. And for those of you who might be wondering how you could tell a security door is alarmed in advance, just simply go near it and look at the map for the color strip tied to the door. Because like you can see with this security door, it is a dark red color strip, which means that there is an alarm tied to it. But this security door over here is a light red color strip, which means there's no alarm tied to it whatsoever. The only exception to this rule is if the security door requires a color key card to open it up. Because as you may notice, this door up here has a light red color strip tied to it, but I said that there was an alarm. And that's because that color strip doesn't update until we put the key card in. So just keep in mind that key card doors can either be a just full team scan door, or it can be an alarm and you won't know until you plug the key card into it. The second thing that you're going to want to check for would just simply be where enemies can potentially spawn from, which in this game is pretty easy to figure out as there's a rule that almost applies to every single situation, and that would be the 2 room away rule, which the name itself basically says it all. When you're dealing with an alarm door, or maybe a scout alerted, or you're dealing with an error alarm, or just anything that causes enemies to spawn in, 99% of the time they are going to be spawning in 2 rooms away from you and your team. There are a few rare exceptions where they'll spawn 3 rooms away, or maybe 1 room away, or even in the same room as you, but those are tied to very specific instances and it's not a random feature whatsoever. So when dealing with an alarm door, you could just plan accordingly to the 2 room away rule. So all you have to do is open up your map and see which rooms are 2 rooms away, which you can very easily do by just simply looking at the doors, as those are room dividers, or look at the lettering of the rooms, because sometimes a level will have an open room divider in it, which means that the rooms are actually separated and considered different rooms, but there's no actual door between them. So just take a look and just plan it out with the map, and if you haven't fully explored the area, make sure you fully explore it. That way you visit every room that is not only 1 room away from you, but also 2 rooms away from you. Because the other thing you want to do is make sure that there are no sleeping enemies in any of those rooms, because if you leave anything left alive, there's a chance that when those alarm door enemies come after you, they will scream when they're 2 or 1 room away from you, which will then trigger everything in that room, and now you have so many more enemies coming after you than you should have in the first place. So figure out where enemies potentially spawn from, then go out and clear out every single one of those rooms if you haven't already, and once you've done that, you can move on to step 3. Step 3 would then be to figure out the likely route that enemies are going to take, which can actually be pretty easily done if you know how the AI works, even though sometimes they are a little bit sporadic and they like to break their own rules, but that doesn't happen too terribly often, thankfully. So the rule for AI is when they are 2 or more rooms away from you, they will take the closest door to their spawn location. So if there's only 1 door they could break down to get into the next room, then they'll obviously go for that 1 door. But if there are 2, 3, or even 4 doors they could break down to get into a room that's only 1 room away from you, they'll just break down whichever door they spawn the closest to. Which means that if one wave spawns there, they'll break down 1 door, but then if the next wave spawns somewhere else in the room, instead of going for that open door, they'll go for the other closed door that is the closest to them. So whenever you're dealing with an alarm and there are multiple doors that are 2 rooms away from you, you might as well shut every single one of them, assuming you're not preserving them for a later alarm or for some other reason. But then, once enemies are only 1 room away from you, their AI will change. They'll no longer go for what they consider the closest door to them, but rather they'll go for whatever they consider the fastest route. Which in some situations, if you leave every single door shut, that is just simply the closest door to them. In other situations though, maybe they'll take a different door that's not really closer to them, but it's closer to where you are in the room. But something you could do to greatly manipulate the AI, and I highly recommend you take advantage of this if the level gives you a good opportunity to, is leave a door open. Because enemies will consider an open door much faster, even if it's far away from them, than a closed door that's really close. A good example of this would be this map overlay right here from R6C1. In this instance, if enemies spawn from the south, they'll obviously go through the open room divider, as that's the only way to get out of that room. And if we have both of these doors shut, they'll take this door right here, as it's much closer to them and us, so it's the faster route. But if we leave this door right here open, they will instead go up a staircase to the left of them, go across a catwalk, go through the open door, and then go down another flight of stairs and come at us from the western side. And then when it comes to the northern enemies, it's pretty much the same thing. If we left every single one of these 3 doors shut, then they will more than likely go for this door right here, as breaking it down would lead them right to where we are and where we'll be doing our scans at. But if we leave this door right here open and make sure the other ones are kept shut, they will actually go down the middle of the room, go up a flight of stairs, go through that door, then walk across a catwalk that's up above in the room, and come down that same flight of stairs that the other enemies are coming from to get to us. Which means it doesn't matter if they come from the north or from the south, they're going to come through the same funnel point to get to us and our team. And as you can see in the background footage, I've got a few sentries positioned facing towards that direction, which makes it so that it's so much easier to deal with this alarm. I don't have to worry about mining and seafoaming multiple doors and still having enemies come from multiple directions. I'm just leaving them open, and yeah, I can't utilize mines or seafoam that efficiently, but sentries will do the job even better, as they'll be more ammo efficient, and I don't have to worry about getting surrounded by enemies whatsoever. And now that you have thoroughly analyzed your surroundings, and you know where enemies are going to be spawning from, and you have a good idea of what route they're going to be taking to get into your room, it's time to finally utilize your tools and set up your defenses. So first things first, make sure you shut every single door you plan on keeping shut during the alarm, and make sure you open every single door you want to funnel enemies through or preserve for later. And then once you have all that done, you can start using things like your mine deployer, your seafoam launcher, or your sentries. Which I'm not going to go into great detail on how you can utilize them here, since I've already made a tool guide that does a pretty good job of talking about that type of stuff already. So if you haven't already, highly recommend you go and watch that video after this one, or just whenever you have free time. But for this moment right here, since I don't want to simply say nothing, I will give you a few basics on how to use these. So when it comes to mines and seafoam, please, for the love of everything holy, don't just use them randomly. I've seen so many people just spray seafoam all over the floor or place mines in the open out throughout the room, and it's just such an inefficient thing to do. When you place a mine out in the open, you might blow up 5 or 6 enemies with it, or you might only just blow up a single enemy or 2, and that's incredibly inefficient. If you're going to use mines, make sure you place it on a door that is shut. That way, while enemies are trying to break it down, they're piling up on the door, and when it does break open, they take one step into it, the mine goes off, and most, if not everything that's currently at that door is going to explode. Seafoam is basically the same way too. I would not recommend you place seafoam all over the floor, and I wouldn't even recommend you seafoam a door unless if you have a mine on it. Because if you just simply shut a door and seafoam it, but there's no sentry on the outside or no mine on the door, you're just having enemies pile up for really no good reason. Yeah, you're stalling them so you have more time to focus on the scans, but when they do break down that door, you're going to have a lot of enemies right there in your face, so unless you have some pierce weapons or maybe just some weapons with large magazines, you're going to have a lot of stuff you have to shoot at all at once, and there's a good chance you're going to get hit quite a bit. So a perfect use of seafoam would be seafoaming a door that you have a mine or two on. That way it reinforces it, it takes long for the enemies to break it down, and once they do, they all go boom. But only seafoam in mine doors if you have a really good idea that enemies will be coming through it. If there are 3 different entrances to your room and you've kept every single one shut and you don't really know which one they're going to take, you could place a mine on all 3 doors since you could pick up the unused mines afterwards, but seafoam you can't. So maybe just seafoam each door with a little bit, and then after you finish a full team scan, have the person with the seafoam launcher run over to that door and just see which one is getting hit, and then they can fully reinforce it and then go back and help the teammates with the scans. As for your sentries, please don't make the mistake of placing them near you because I see a lot of people do that as well. A lot of people like to put them down really close to the security door where they'll be starting the scans at, and this doesn't really do a whole lot of good because yeah, you're well defended when you're doing the full team scan right next to the door, but the moment you have to move away from the door to work on the other sets of scans, you have a sentry that's either not really going to do anything because enemies aren't going to be going near it to get to you, or you have a sentry that is on one side of you and enemies on the other side, which means you are not only in direct line of fire of the enemies, but the sentry as well. I've seen a lot of people get their head shot off by a sniper sentry because they do this. So when it comes to your sentries, place them near the entrances that enemies will be taking to get into your room. That way when they come through that open door you're using for a funnel, the sentries will shoot at them, or when you place it near a door that is shut, mined, and seafoam, once the door breaks open, the mine goes off, any enemy that survives will then be shot by the sentries, and then when the next wave spawns in and arrives at that door, the sentries will start shooting at them. You don't want to just place them randomly in the room though, because if you do, you're going to get shot by them and they aren't really all that efficient. So make sure you're being smart with your resources and you're being a little bit conservative, especially when dealing with easier alarms. If you're dealing with something like a class 2 or 3 or 4 alarm, you do not need to set nearly as many defenses as if you were setting up for a 5, 6, or even a 7. So also take in consideration what type of alarm it is that you are doing. And with your perfect defense finally set up, there's only one thing left to do, and that's work on the alarm door itself. So everybody head over to that door, pull that lever, get to work on the full team scan, and then work on every single one of the sets of scans afterwards. When you're dealing with an alarm door, there's always one of 2 things you should actively be doing, and that's either 1, standing in a scan or making your way towards one, that way you can complete it as quickly as possible, or 2, defending against the enemies by going near where they'll be coming into the room from and popping heads left and right and keeping your teammates safe. If you're not actively working on a scan or shooting at enemies that are in the room with you, you need to make sure you're doing that. The faster you get every single one of the sets of scans completed, the faster you shut off the alarm, which means the faster enemies stop spawning in, which results in fewer resources needing to be spent here. So do your best to get the scans done as quickly as can, but at the same time, don't go on a suicide mission. If you find yourself in a situation where there's a scan in front of you, but there's also about 5 or 7 enemies right there in front of you blocking you from getting to the scan, fall back a little bit and deal with those enemies first. You do not need to rush headfirst through a horde of enemies and risk about 40, 50, 60, or 70% of your HP just to finish the scan. Unless if it's a very last scan and you're willing to make that sacrifice because you know your teammates can cover up the rest and they'll be fine without you. But if that isn't the situation, do not do it. I've seen a lot of people sacrifice themselves trying to finish one scan which isn't even worth it to do in the first place. And the other thing too is when you finish all those scans and you see at the top of your screen the text that appears that's saying that the door has been unlocked, do not open that door. I've seen so many people make this mistake too, even long-term players who have multiple hundreds of hours in this game, where you're in the middle of an alarm and then they just open up the security door for no good reason. Because all this is going to do is make it that while you're still shooting and dealing with a few enemies that are still left over from the alarm, you're going to wake up the room that you just opened up, which means now you can have anywhere from 5 to 20 enemies coming after you, or heck, even worse, maybe a scout is in that room and screams, and now you have a room that just woke up, you have the alarm door enemies coming at you, and you have these scout enemies coming at you all from different directions, and now you're in a really tough situation. So make sure that while you're dealing with an alarm, you're prioritizing scans and getting them done as fast as you can, and once the alarm is done, deal with every single one of the leftover enemies, make sure everything is completely dead, then pack up your sentries, pick up any mines that didn't get expended, and then go over to the door, open it up, and head into the next area as a team. And with that, another GTFO guide comes to an end. Just like many of the others, it took me a lot longer to get this one out than I originally hoped for, but that unfortunately just seems to be the trend with me at this point. Never enough time to work on all these videos before I'm swamped with the release of another rundown. But I suppose it's better to be busy than have idle hands, and better to be late than never. This is now the 6th general guide I've made for GTFO, and I'm sure there's still more to be made as time goes on. I know people have been asking me for a guide on bots as well as one on stealth for a while now, so I'll have to make sure I get around to those when I have the ample time to. And hey, if you have ideas for guides that you would like to see me make, let me know down in the comments and maybe one day they'll become a video. As always though, thank you for watching this video all the way to the very end. If you have any questions in regard to something discussed in this video or anything else in relation to GTFO, please do let me know down in the comments. Hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more from me, I do always greatly appreciate it. And if you want to join the community I'm building, there's a link to my Discord down in the description, as well as some other links. Among those links being one that will take you to the official GTFO merch store, which I highly recommend you check out if you're a fellow GTFO enthusiast. Around the time this video is released, we should be getting close to the Christmas season, so hey, maybe there might be some nice deals there. Who knows? I'm not sponsored, so I'm not told anything. Until next time though, don't be afraid to experiment and try out new strategies when dealing with alarm doors. You'll never know what does and doesn't work until you attempt it. And hopefully, I'll see you all in the next video.